Snow was falling heavily over the small town of Maple Creek, Ohio, covering the roads in thick white sheets. The storm was so fierce that cars had been abandoned along the highway, and the world outside looked like a frozen desert. At the edge of town stood a small wooden cabin, its chimney releasing a thin trail of smoke. Inside lived Edward Miller, a kind old man with silver hair and gentle eyes. Edward had lived alone ever since his wife passed away. His children had long moved to different states, building their own lives, leaving him with only memories and a quiet home. On this stormy night, Edward sat by his fireplace, reading an old Bible, whispering a prayer that anyone stuck out in the cold might find warmth and shelter. Just then, a knock rattled his door. Startled, he set down his book and went to answer. When he opened it, his heart stopped. Standing there were 10 young girls, none older than 12. Their hair was messy, their coats thin, and their little hands were stiff from the freezing wind. One of the older girls spoke softly. "Sir, we're from the orphanage. The bus broke down in the storm. We don't know where else to go." Edward's heart ached at the sight. Without hesitation, he said, "Come in, children, quickly before you freeze." The girls rushed inside, their small shoes leaving wet trails across his wooden floor. Edward didn't have much food, but he gathered what he could: soup, bread, and some hot cocoa he always kept in the cupboard. He wrapped them in extra blankets, stoked the fire higher, and even told them bedtime stories to ease their fears. That night, his quiet cabin was filled with giggles, soft chatter, and the warmth of little souls who had found safety. By morning, the storm had passed. Edward expected the girls' caretakers would eventually come looking for them. But when he stepped outside, he froze in disbelief. Several black luxury cars, Cadillacs, Lincolns, and SUVs, were lined up along the snowy street in front of his cabin. Men in suits and women in elegant coats stepped out, rushing toward the house. One of the men, Mr. Jonathan Parker, a wealthy businessman from New York, hugged one of the girls tightly. "Lily, thank God you're safe." Soon Edward realized that the girls were orphans, being sponsored by some of the wealthiest families in America. They had been traveling with their guardians when the storm separated them. The parents and sponsors, overwhelmed with relief, turned to Edward with gratitude. Mr. Parker stepped forward, shaking Edward's hand firmly. "Sir, you saved our daughters when no one else could. We owe you everything." From the car trunks, they began unloading groceries, warm clothes, and even new furniture for Edward's cabin. One family offered to renovate his home, another promised to visit him often, and Mr. Parker insisted on providing Edward with a new truck so he'd never be stranded in a storm again. Edward's eyes welled up with tears as he looked around at the families and the children. In all his years of living alone, he had never imagined such a moment. A quiet old cabin suddenly filled with life, warmth, and gratitude. He hadn't opened his door for recognition or reward. He had done it simply because 10 frightened little girls had knocked in the middle of a storm. He thought back to that night when the wind howled like a beast and the snow threatened to bury everything in sight. He could have ignored the knocking, pretending he hadn't heard it. But his heart had told him otherwise. "Do what's right," he had whispered to himself, and so he did. That one simple choice had changed everything. Now, as Edward stood among the wealthy families who were showering him with thanks, he felt something stir inside him, a reminder that compassion is never wasted. Acts of kindness may seem small at the time, but they ripple outward, touching lives in ways we may never fully understand. Edward realized something powerful that morning. Kindness always finds its way back, multiplied beyond measure. It returns when we least expect it, sometimes with gifts, sometimes with friendship, and sometimes with love. And in that snowy little town, Edward's quiet act of mercy had blossomed into a bond that would last a lifetime. From that day forward, Edward's life was never the same. The silence that had once filled his little wooden cabin was replaced with the sound of laughter, footsteps, and voices that warmed his heart. The man who had spent so many winters alone finally felt the joy of belonging once more. The families who had once been complete strangers now looked at Edward with deep affection. They treated him not as an outsider, but as one of their own. To the children, he became a gentle grandfather figure, the one who had opened his door when the storm raged and the night was at its darkest. Edward's home, once a quiet place of solitude, blossomed into a haven of love. The fire in his hearth burned bright, Edward's home, once a quiet place of solitude, blossomed into a haven of love. The fire in his hearth burned brighter, not just with wood, but with the warmth of new relationships. Where there had once been emptiness, now there was community, kindness, and care. Every visit, every letter, and every smile reminded Edward of a beautiful truth. Compassion has the power to rewrite even the loneliest chapters of life. He hadn't just saved 10 orphan girls. In many ways, they had saved him too, filling his days with purpose and his nights with peace. And so, that one small act on a snowy night became the beginning of something far greater than Edward could have ever dreamed. What had started as a simple gesture, opening his door to 10 helpless girls, turned into a story that would live in hearts forever. That open door was more than just shelter from the storm. It was a doorway into love, trust, and connection. In that single choice to show kindness, Edward had planted a seed that grew into unshakable bonds between him and families who had once been strangers. Time passed, seasons changed, but those bonds never faded. Every smile, every visit, and every moment of gratitude reminded Edward that compassion is stronger than loneliness, and love has the power to heal even the deepest emptiness. Edward now carried a certainty in his heart. Mercy and kindness never go to waste. They always return. Not just the same, but greater, stronger, and far more beautiful than anyone could ever imagine.